see everyone here again this morning. You can turn with me to Esther chapter 3. We're going to be diving right into our text this morning. Not a whole lot of preamble before it today, but we are obviously in our third week in the study of Esther. I'll be preaching this week. The next 2 weeks, Pastor Owen is going to be taking over. We got a little bit of holidays this week. We're going camping for a few days, so hopefully it doesn't rain too much. Not that we can control any of that, but it'll be a good time, I'm sure. Owen's going to take the next 2 weeks, which will cover Esther kind of chapter 4 or 5-ish. Sort of going through this kind of a chapter a week, that sort of pace, but I hope you've been enjoying it so far, and I hope you've been able to maybe learn a little bit of something new about Esther and about some of the bigger behind-the-scenes pictures that we see in this book. I know it's been a good thing for me to be working through, and even it's one of those books where you kind of see a similar thing in it in a lot of chapters, and even that has been a challenge to me, not to get stuck in repetition for one thing, but also just the driving point of God being in control through this story. It's going to be something, like I said, we'll talk about likely every week, and it's important that we see that in every aspect of what's going on here. And so today we're going to see the plot thicken in the book of Esther a little bit. We're going to see the villain introduced into this story, the antagonist, if you want to call it that. We're going to see him hatch a plot to wipe the Jewish people out of the Persian Empire. We covered a few weeks ago when we started this series that the Persian Empire was a lot of the known world at this time, and so this was a fairly widespread threat to people from that Jewish heritage, and we'll see how that all comes about. We're going to see this plot made public and a day chosen for this, what amounts to an extermination, essentially, of the Jewish people to happen, and things seem quite hopeless for the Jewish people, and they don't really get resolved in this chapter. Where we're kind of left hanging. We get the benefit of being able to read through the whole of the book of Esther, and so we can see how it resolves, but in this chapter, I kind of want to hang us in that tension a little bit of the Jewish people not knowing how this is all going to get resolved, and yet in the midst of it all, we're going to see a glimpse of hope if the Jewish people are willing to see it based on the timing of some of these things that happen. It's subtle, but there is a little glimmer of hope that we're going to see as we work our way through Esther chapter 3. And so let's pray together, and then we'll dive in. Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the book of Esther. Thank you for the lessons that we can learn in this book about your sovereignty, your control. And Lord, today I pray that we can just be struck today by the fact that regardless of what we're facing, what we're going through, Lord, that we can cling to the promise that you are with us. And Lord, that'll just sit with us as we work through Esther 3 and as we see kind of a hopeless situation playing out, at least in this chapter, Lord, that we can just be challenged with that fact that even when times seem like that in our lives, Lord, that we can cling to those promises that you're with us based on how you've promised to act and how you've acted in the past and your faithful nature like that. And so just give us clear minds and the ability to focus here for the next few moments as we work through this chapter, and thank you for it. In your name, amen. Esther chapter 3. We're going to read verses 1 to 6 to start off with. It says, After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So think back for a second to how Esther chapter 2 ended. If you were here last week, maybe you can remember some of the things we talked about. If you weren't, just read through verses 19 to 23 of Esther 2 real quick. Just skim through it and consider there that Mordecai had shown himself to be someone who would deserve a promotion like what Haman received here. He had alerted the king to an assassination plot on his life, an attempt made to kill the king, or at least it was in process, and he stopped it. And we saw him rewarded to a point in Esther chapter 2, and that reward for him at that point essentially was, we'll write down your name in the history books as the one who stifled this assassination attempt, but we're not really told if there's anything more done for him. We don't get the sense that there was at this point. It was just noted that he had been the one to uncover this plot, and it sort of ended at that. And so with that in mind, we understand maybe some of the feelings that Mordecai may have had towards Haman here as Esther chapter 3 comes in, and Esther chapter 3 shows us that Haman was the one promoted. And we're not told why Haman was promoted, whether he had done something exemplary that made him, worthy of this high promotion, or whether, he had got it through underhanded means. We're not told any of those sorts of things. We're simply told that he was the one that the king had chosen to promote. Now, these events aren't overlapping. It's not that Mordecai saved the king and Haman stole his promotion. That's not what I'm trying to say. I just want you to see sort of the contrast here between what the king didn't do for Mordecai and what he did do for Haman here at the start of Esther chapter 3. The author tells us here, as he's introducing Haman, who, by the way, is the villain of the story. He's the fourth main character, the final main character that we'll really highlight as we go, and we'll see these four, Mordecai and Esther and King Ahasuerus and Haman. We'll see them interacting throughout the rest of the story. Haman is the villain, and he's going to show us why he's the villain here as Esther chapter 3 plays out. And as the author is introducing who Haman is, he gives us some clues and some hints about where this man is from. We're told that he's an Agagite, and on maybe at first glance that might not seem significant, unless you've been spending some time lately in places in the Bible like Exodus, around Exodus 17, or 1 Samuel 15 in the life of King Saul. If you've been in that in maybe your devotions or studying in your recent devotional life, then that name Agag may ring a bell. And I think this is a significant thing here. Back in 1 Samuel 15, King Saul is commanded to attack a group of people called the Amalekites, and he was told to do this as a repayment for what the Amalekites had done to the Israelites way back in Exodus 17. They had attacked Israel when Israel was making their way out of Egypt, and as basically a payment for that, as God's way of finding justice for these people, Israel was told, under the leadership of King Saul, to go and attack the Amalekites and their king Agag, and to make sure that none of them were alive following this thing. It was supposed to be a complete annihilation of these people. 1 Samuel 15 tells us that Saul did not follow through on this, and this was one of the key turning points in King Saul's life, where the crown was essentially taken from him, not literally at this point, but God told him that this will be the end of your dynasty. You won't have a son ruling after you because of your disobedience here, and a few other things along the way as well. And ultimately we see that the Amalekites were destroyed at that point, but there is still enough trace there that there is this descendant that has come now in the Persian Empire, this Agagite named Haman. What we're going to see here, also a bit of an interesting thing as we go, is think back to how Mordecai was introduced a few chapters ago. What line is he from in the Israelite lineage? He's from the line of Kish, which is the same line that King Saul was from. And so we sort of see a repeat here of a descendant of Kish and this Agagite sort of facing off here again. We see a similar thing to 1 Samuel 15, although it's going to turn out a little bit differently. And so that isn't the hinge point of this chapter, but it's just sort of showing you how this fits into the larger narrative of the Old Testament, and that this book has a definite place there. Haman, this descendant of an ancient enemy of God's people, because of their treatment of Israel in the past, was promoted above all of his peers and given this place of honor in the Persian Empire. As a sign of recognition of Haman's new role, there was a command that came out from the king that everyone was supposed to bow down and pay homage to Haman. Now, this wouldn't have been an abnormal thing. You see other places, even in Scripture, when someone is in a high place, there's honor that's due them. And so it's interesting that Haman needed a command given by the king for this to happen. We've already seen Ahasuerus as one who's eager to make decrees about anything and everything, and so this may just be an extension of that. Remember when he was throwing the big party back in Esther chapter 1, he even gave a law about how people should consume their wine at this party, and so he's not scared about making these little micromanaging kind of laws. But maybe this speaks a little bit larger to the issue of Haman's character. Maybe he wasn't someone who was naturally, deserving of respect. We've come across people probably in our lives before who it's easy to respect, who it's easy to give the honor that is due the position that they have, and we come across other people who that's a fair bit more difficult, and maybe Haman falls into that category. That's just a little bit of speculation. We can't go too far down that. Regardless, there was a order made. Everyone was supposed to bow down and pay homage to Haman when he came by, and almost everybody in Persia did, except one man. Mordecai did not. And the author doesn't tell us here. Again, this would be nice to know a little bit more detail, but the author doesn't tell us why. We're not told if by bowing down it would be, equal to worshiping Haman or to treating him as a god. We've seen that elsewhere. You think of the book of Daniel. There are times when, foreign rulers will make these declarations. You have to bow down, you have to worship me. Maybe there was that undercurrent here. Maybe it's the history between this Agagite and Mordecai as a Jewish person from the line of Kish. Maybe that's what's causing him to pause and not follow through and not bow down. Regardless, we are told that he doesn't do it. Later on, we find that his Jewish heritage has something to do with that, even though we're not told exactly what. And we're told that he didn't bow down to Haman when he came by, like everyone else did. Those around Mordecai noticed this, and they started to ask him questions. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing what the king has commanded us to do here and honor Haman in this way? And day after day they asked him, and day after day Mordecai continued to refuse, and likely was giving the same, the same reasoning day after day, and eventually they got to the place where they had to bring it to Haman, and the question that they raised as they did that, is he going to continue basically to do this when Haman finds out about it? Is he going to be willing to, follow through on this when it really comes down to it? Haman hadn't actually noticed Mordecai not bowing. He has to be alerted to this, and so Mordecai wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't causing, getting a bunch of people on his side and making a big deal out of it. It was so subtle that this Haman guy hadn't even noticed it. When he was alerted to the fact that there was someone who wasn't giving him the honor that he thought he was due, he was furious. And this reminds me a bit about how King Ahasuerus has been responding throughout this story in the past. Think again back to the early chapters of Esther, when Vashti refused to do what King Ahasuerus had commanded her to do. He was furious, and that is what spurred on this whole opening of the door for Esther to come onto the scene in the first place. And again, we're going to see Haman make some poor decisions here in his anger, but again, we're going to see that God's hand is in this throughout it as well. Haman is furious when he finds out about this, and he comes to the realization somehow that punishing Mordecai alone isn't enough. This needs to be something bigger. There needs to be a larger consequence for the actions of this one person. He finds out he's a Jewish person, and he says, perfect, that whole ethnic group essentially in the Empire of Persia, they're going to pay for this slight against Haman. And we're going to see that play out here as Esther 3 carries on. Let's keep reading, and we'll go through it. Starting at verse 7, it says, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day. They cast him month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of other people. They do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. I read in another translation that says 375 tons, so this is a large amount of money. I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who may have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So the king took a signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you and the people also. Do to them as it seems good to you. November 9th and 10th, 1938 are remembered in the history books as Kristallnacht. And I'm probably mispronouncing that, but they're remembered as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And during these 2 days, what the world began to get a peek at was what they would see done regularly throughout the next 7-8 years of Nazi rule in Germany, and that is the specific persecution of certain ethnic groups, primarily the Jewish people, although they weren't the only ones involved in this, but they are definitely the largest group that were involved and targeted in this. Kristallnacht was sparked by the assassination of a German diplomat by a Polish-born Jewish man named Herschel Grinspan. And when news of this diplomat's death reached the Nazi Party leader Adolf Hitler, he was in some meetings with other key officials. He left before he could give a speech that he had prepared to give, and someone else gave it in his place. And in that address, it was stated that demonstrations, in other words, protests or showings of anger against this killing of the German diplomat, demonstrations should not be organized by Nazi Party leaders. However, where they do occur, they should not be hampered. Later orders by a director of the German police showed that targeted attacks on Jewish synagogues were coming, and that the police were not to step in and intervene. They weren't to be stopped. And so this wasn't officially organized by the Nazi Party, but it kind of was, all at the same time. In other words, the door was open to repay the Jewish community, already hated by Hitler, as shown by his blaming them for everything from Germany's loss in World War I to the stock market collapse of the 30s for this killing. The death of one German diplomat, an action done by one single Jewish person, became justification for very widespread and very brutal attacks on the whole nation. And that's kind of what we see happening here in the book of Esther as well. The world looked on in disbelief as these events took place, and it was only the beginning of these attacks on Jews in Germany. And there was just some interesting similarities here between what Haman is doing and taking one action by one Jewish person and spinning it to an opportunity to wipe the entire ethnic group off the face of the earth, is what we see happening here with Hitler in Germany. There's a few different similarities through the book of Esther that way as well. Haman began his plotting by slowly and methodically and very superstitiously picking the date on when this extermination is going to happen. And the method that he used for this was casting lots. So somehow, whether it was dice or something like that, they would cast this these lots, and through this they would find out, okay, here's the month, here's the day, the best time for this to happen. And this is, I say it's superstitious because it's not that they just pick a date out of the hat. They want to pick the right day, and they're going to trust that through this casting of the lot, they're going to be able to find what the right day is. We actually find the whole idea of casting lots happening in Scripture as well, but here it's not a superstitious thing. Here it's a recognition that we're going to cast these lots, and we're going to trust that whatever comes through it is what God is wanting to have happen. They're going to trust that He's going to allow these things to land where they want to land. And even in this, we're going to see that God's hand is in this casting of the lots as well, on the specific day that is chosen here in this passage. He made his choice in the first month, in Nisan, in the 12th year of the king. The lot was rolled over and over until finally the 13th day of the 12th month was chosen. And that's significant because there's almost a year that is going to happen here between when this decision is made for the extermination of the Jews and the date when it's actually going to happen, which gives lots of time for Haman to really nurse his anger. It gives a lot of time for the Jewish people who are living in Persia to either flee if they have the means and the ability to do so, which in Haman's mind would still help solve the problem because they're leaving. Or if they can't leave, it gives a lot of time for fear and terror and just, the realization of what's coming to set in. And when you consider Haman and what we know about him, that was maybe part of what he liked about this whole idea of it being a year away. There's a lot of time to watch people squirm, which is putting it very lightly when they consider what is coming there on the 13th day of the 12th month. Having put this plan together, Haman went to the king and he packaged this whole thing in a way that reminds me of what happened again back in Esther 1 with Queen Vashti. He takes a single event, a rather small event, and blows it into something much bigger than it actually was. He starts with something that is true and then adds something that's kind of true and ends up somewhere that is nowhere near the truth in his conclusion. And so the part that is true is that there's a people scattered throughout the world, throughout the empire, who live differently, who live separately, who have different laws and customs than everyone else does. And he's talking about the Jewish people, and that is true. They're spread out throughout the Persian Empire, and their laws and their customs and their mindset and the God they worship, this is all different than the Persian people around them and the other nations around them. And so that part is absolutely true. The next thing that he says is that they don't obey the king's laws. Now this is partially true because one Jewish person, Mordecai, disobeyed one specific law of the king, and that is that he didn't give Haman the honor that was due him based on this law the king Ahasuerus had put in this specific thing. And so there's an element of truth to this, but the way that Haman packages it makes it seem like if you're a Jewish person living in Persia, you don't obey any of the laws of the king, and you have no respect whatsoever for anything that happens here under the Persian Empire. He wants the king to see these people as expendable. And as something, he says it's not in the king's welfare. How does he word it there? It says, let me find it here. It's not to the king's profit to tolerate them. So essentially, if you wipe these people off the face of the empire, you're going to be better off for it. It's not to your profit to let them survive. And so this is the problem that he lays out the solution. He basically says, I'll deal with them. I'll make sure that they're no longer a problem. He doesn't go into the specifics here of what this will look like, that it's going to be a mass extermination, but he basically says, we'll deal with them, and on top of that, I'll pay this massive amount of money into the king's treasuries. 10,000 talents of silver, 375 tons, I saw somewhere, that was like 60% of the income of the empire for 1 year. So we're talking a substantial amount of money that Haman had offered to pay the king as well, just kind of sweetening the deal here a little bit. Just like that, the king was on board. He gives a signet ring. The signet ring is what would give Haman the ability to write a law and stamp it basically with the seal of the king, and to say that this is something that the king approves of. It has all the power that comes with the name of the king on it. This is actually a law, and says to Haman, you go ahead, you do with these people as you see best, as you see fit. Keep reading. It says, and the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps, to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language. The idea here is that this is widespread. There's going to be nowhere the Jewish people within the Persian Empire can hide from this. Every language, every culture is covered here. If you live in the Persian Empire, you will hear about this edict in a way that makes sense to you, so that all Jewish people will understand that they are the target, and everyone else around them will understand to target the Jewish people. It was written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy and kill and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. There's a detail in Esther 3 verse 12 that I hadn't caught before I started studying into this, and I think unless you're very familiar with the specific dates of the Hebrew calendar, it might not be something that seems significant to you offhand as well, but for someone from a Hebrew background, especially the early readers of this book, they would have recognized that the fact that this law came into effect on the 13th day of the first month is extremely significant, because the 14th day of the first month is Passover. And so the day right before Passover, well, think for a second about what Passover celebrates and what it signifies. It reminds God's people of the way that He had delivered them from a very seemingly hopeless situation in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. They were targeted, by Pharaoh to wipe out all the male babies when they were born. There was lots of evil being done to them in Egypt, and the way that they got out of that was that God stepped in and miraculously delivered them from what was happening in Egypt. And so Passover was meant to remind them of how that happened. And so the day before this annual celebration of Passover, all of a sudden here's this edict that in a year's time or so, the Jews are going to be exterminated. And I think this is where we can see that glimmer of hope for the Jewish people. The next day, assuming that they were still keeping the Passover celebration while they were in exile, some likely weren't, some maybe were, but assuming that they were, when they sat down to celebrate Passover, they would be faced with another seemingly hopeless situation. This looks pretty dark for Israel and for the Jewish people living in Persia at this point. How are they going to get out of this? There's this empire-wide edict that has been passed for their extermination. Everybody knows about it, and as time went on, it would just be driven home again and again how many different people knew about it, and the fact that they were not only to be killed, but that their stuff was to be plundered just kind of sweetened the deal for their neighbors around them who started to maybe eye up their stuff and some of these sorts of things. The situation likely just seemed more and more hopeless the longer it dragged out. But then the next day was Passover. This reminder of God's faithful deliverance of them in the past, and it's just, I think, a good reminder that we can see that hopefully some of them begin to recognize that if they were to get out of this situation, God would be the only way that it would be possible. Because things seem very, very bleak for them at this point. Freedom was to be celebrated on the Passover day, and now the Jewish people were forced to look to God to again deliver them as He had done in the past. There would still be massive uncertainty as to how this deliverance could happen, and things would likely have seemed pretty bleak at this point. But as we'll see, God would again deliver His people. Haman wrote the command as it appears in Esther 3:13 to destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jewish people, young and old, women and children, on the 13th day of the 12th month, and to plunder their goods. And this was sent out immediately, empire-wide, and just as a reminder of how maybe oblivious or cold or heartless or whatever the king and Ahasuerus were when the city around them was thrown into confusion here, they sit down and they're going to celebrate. They're going to sit down and drink. And again, Esther chapter 2, after Esther was anointed king, after she was chosen king, there was a feast thrown. So this is sort of how Ahasuerus seems to mark significant moments in his kingdom. And again, we see him sitting down to celebrate. The king possibly oblivious to what's all going on here. And Haman very, very much would have been celebrating the chance that he had here to take revenge and to get the honor that was due him in this moment. As we've said a few times, it's a little tough to see a light at the end of the tunnel here for the Jewish people. And that's one of the things I think is easy to struggle with when we can sit down and read all of the book of Esther in half an hour. We can see how this plays out, right? We can see years of history unfold before us, but the reality is, as we read, the events of something like Kristallnacht back in 1938, as we read these events here and we think about it in the moment, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. And I think, I say this carefully, in a very small way, the events in the world we're living in right now with the whole pandemic thing, and we don't know exactly when it's going to end, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. It's not the same as an ethnic cleansing. Please understand, this is a different thing. But at the same time, there's an element of uncertainty in our world today, right? We don't know how this is going to turn out. We don't know when we're going to be able to meet back together again as a church in the sanctuary without all the distancing and the hand sanitizing and all that sort of stuff, masks when we sing. We don't know when some of these things are going to come off. And when we're going to be able to get back to things like normal. And so maybe in a very, very small way, maybe we can empathize with what the Jewish people were going through here, just in that sense of uncertainty. Their situation's much different, but that sense of uncertainty, I think, is there nonetheless. So with that in mind, the tying to Passover and the past faithfulness of God is that much more crucial for us to understand, both for the Jewish people living in Persia, that understanding of the past faithfulness of God and that call to trust that He can act in that way again if He chooses to, is important for those Jewish people in Persia, but it's also something that's important for you and for I to wrestle with today as we face uncertain circumstances. I picked the pandemic because it's sort of the low-hanging fruit these days, right? Like it's something that we're all interacting with in some way, shape, or form. It's impacted our life in some way, right? But in the individual families and in the individual people sitting around this room, there's other things represented that present that same uncertain circumstance. And I don't know what's all happening in your lives and in your families and in your neighbors and all this different sort of stuff, but chances are there are these elements of uncertainty. If you're not facing it now, you either have or you will at some point. You'll be in a situation where you don't know how it's going to turn out. And I think we can learn from how God lines up the events here in Esther chapter 3 that God is calling us to trust Him in the midst of that. But we also see reflected elsewhere in Scripture, like in Psalm 23, which Sarah is going to read for us here in her second package of songs. We're going to see promises and we're going to see reminders that God is with us even in those times when we do things like walk through the valley of the shadow of death, when we have the enemies all around us and God still prepares a table for us in the presence of those enemies. Doesn't necessarily yank us out of that situation, but in the midst of it, He gives us rest and He gives us what we need and sustenance, and He provides for us in the midst of that. And I think the Jewish people here in Esther chapter 3 had an opportunity, with Passover so closely tied to this edict, they had an opportunity to see that God had provided for them in the past, and it was a call to trust that God could do that again. And for us today, we're not facing the same thing, obviously, but in times of uncertainty, same thing. We're called to trust that God has worked in times of uncertainty in the past, has brought His good purposes through them, and to trust that He can and will do that again. Now, what those good things look like, we don't know, and good in the end may look different than what we're picturing good right now. But do we trust that God has our best interest in mind and that He has a plan, that He is moving forward, that He's with us, and that He's trustworthy throughout it all? By the way, a bit of a side note, but not really. Both the Persian Empire and the Nazi German Empire were outlasted by their Jewish target, for lack of a better term. Right? The Jewish people are still here. Nazi Germany is a blip and a stain on the German past, and the Persian Empire is long gone. And yet the Jewish people are still here. And this story can be a very general reminder that racism in any form is not something that we should be a part of as believers. Anytime a whole ethnic group is targeted for any reason, it's not good, and it's not something we should be a part of as believers. It's something that should bother us as believers. But I think specifically here we see God's heart for Israel come through, and it's just a good challenge for us even in considering that today as well. Owen's going to be preaching for the next 2 weeks, and in that we will see God begin to put his own countermeasures in place to frustrate and to slow down the plans of Haman, and we'll see how that is dealt with. But for today, let's remember that even when things seem hopeless and we don't know exactly how this is going to go and seem pretty bleak, we can and should hold fast to the God who has promised to be with us and to work things for our good in the end, that he will be with us even in the valley of the shadow of death, and that he prepares that table for us even in the midst of uncertain circumstances. These are things that we can hold to, the things that we need to hold to, and the more we can wrap our minds around these things when life is going well, the quicker we turn to them, the quicker we remember them when the bottom drops out, if and when that happens. Let's close in a word of prayer. We've got a few more songs to sing and spend some time worshiping together as our service continues. Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the book of Esther. Thank you for Esther chapter 3 specifically, and how it paints a picture of uncertainty, Lord, of hopelessness, of fear. It paints a very bleak future for the Israelite people, especially when you take Esther 3 just as itself and don't look ahead to how it's going to turn out. But Lord, thank you that even in the midst of that uncertainty, Lord, there's that glimmer of hope and that reminder that uncertain things to us aren't uncertain to you, and impossible things to us aren't impossible for you. And so, Lord, I pray that regardless of the situations that are represented in this room, Lord, whatever is happening in our lives, whether everything is going quite well or whether everything is feeling very shaky these days, Lord, that we can remember your promise to be with us, that we can look to your examples of deliverance and your examples of your faithfulness to your covenants in the past. And Lord, these can be things that encourage us and can be our foundation in times when everything else is quite shaky in the world around us. Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for an opportunity to respond in worship here with a few songs and a very familiar psalm read. Thank you for everyone here this morning. Just be with us in these next few moments. And I pray this worship can be pleasing to you as well. Praise things in your name. Amen.